Today in Modern Horizons 3 spoilers, we get a new Theros Titan, an absurd amount of sweet MDFCs, and a whole bunch more, so let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Modern Horizons 3 spoilers. Today we have some super sweet stuff to talk about, including a whole new cycle, actually 2 new cycles, one of my favorite mechanics in MDFCs, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking spicy new Modern Horizons 3 cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should mosey on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Modern Horizons 3. So first up today, we get a new Theros Titan in Phlage, Titan of Fire's Fury. So you might remember, when we returned to Theros a couple of years ago, we got Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger, and these cards were really good. Uro's like banned everywhere, Kroxa sees heavy play, and Wizards said at the time, there's actually more of these gods or Titans on Theros, but they just didn't have enough room to put them all in the set. So now we see the Boros version coming in Modern Horizons 3 is Phlage, Titan of Fire's Fury. So it's just like the other Titans. It's a 3-mana 6/6. When it ETBs, you gotta sack it unless you escaped it. You can escape it for 4 mana and exiling 5 cards, and then when it ETBs or attacks, it deals 3 damage to any target and you gain 3 life, which means, oh my god, it's a Titan, except it's Lightning Helix. I couldn't resist. So a Lightning Helix, we've seen it come back in Standard. Maybe not as busted as it used to be, but it's still a pretty solid effect, right? For 3 mana, this is hopefully going to kill a creature. It's going to buff your life total. And I've seen a lot of people kind of trashing on this card and saying it's really bad and it's not going to see any play. But I think this card is actually really good. And I think probably Kroxa is the best comparison. This isn't an Uro. It's not going to generate card advantage and ramp you. Uro was just incredibly busted. It was way, way, way too good. I think this is more on the Kroxa level. It's a very useful, but not quite broken, thankfully, Titan. So I think this card will see a decent amount of modern play. The most obvious home, I think, is in some sort of burn deck. And I should clarify here, when I say it'll see modern play, I expect it'll be a lot like Kroxa, where you're playing like a copy or 2 in your deck. I don't think this is a 4-of style card, because taxing your graveyard by exiling 5 cards is really tough for a lot of decks, unless you're dedicated to filling your graveyard. But think about a deck like Burn. You're playing a bunch of Lava Spikes and Lightning Bolts and Fetch Lands. It's pretty easy to, by the time you would want to escape a Phlage, have 5 cards in your graveyard that you don't really care about. So I think that's how Phlage will be used, like a 1-of maybe in a burn style deck. It also synergizes really well with Dragon Rage Channeler, which is really good at filling your graveyard so you can mill over Phlage and escape it, or just use DRC to fill your graveyard so you have cards to escape Phlage. So I'd be very surprised if Burn didn't play like a copy of this, maybe 2 copies of this. It's kind of a finisher. Like, it's not as efficient as a Lightning Bolt, obviously. It's a little expensive, as odd as that sounds, at 3 mana for a burn deck, but it's just such a late game mana sink that's going to be really, really strong when you run out of other action. It's a way to just close out the game. I also think there's other possibilities for this card. There's a Martyr of Sands life gain deck that actually kind of splashes into Boros. Phlage is a white card, so it works with Martyr of Sands, which is nice. And then in the late game, you can just like loop it with a Miri and burn your opponent out of the game. There's even this Omnath Locus of Creation deck that's playing Karuga as a companion. And since Karuga makes you play all things that cost 3 or more, Phlage is like kind of perfect for that deck. So I think you could see a copy or 2 there as well. So there's actually a lot of possibilities for this card. And in some ways, being 3 mana is kind of an upside, because it means you dodge Cascade on things like Shardist Agent and Ardent Plea. So maybe you could show up in some of the Cascade decks as well. It's also a really easy way to flip Sorin. Maybe there's some sort of like weird Mardu life gain deck where you Sorin on turn 2, turn 3, Phlage, flip it, and then you have Sorin Ravenous Neonate to burn your opponent out of the game, make a bunch of food tokens, maybe steal your opponent's stuff. So Phlage, Titan of Fire's Fury, the card's pretty legit. I don't think it's Uro level. I think it's more Kroxa level, but I would be very, very surprised if once Modern Horizons 3 releases, we don't see a copy or 2 of this card showing up in various modern decks, because it's just a really strong effect that buffers your life total and can close out the game and can snipe small creatures. We also got a new 1-mana counter spell in Strix Serenade. So Strix Serenade, 1 mana blue instant. It says counter target artifact, creature, or planeswalker spell. Its controller creates a 2/2 blue bird creature token with flying. So if this card looks familiar, It's basically Swan Song, except it hits the things that Swan Song doesn't. Swan Song, same thing, except it hits enchantments, instants, and sorceries. Strix Serenade hits artifacts, creatures, or planeswalkers. The question is, can you actually play this card outside of Commander? In Commander, this card's going to be great. Swan Song is one of the most played cards in Commander, one of the most played blue cards, and since you start with 40 life, giving your opponent a 2/2 blue bird token isn't really a big deal. In a 20 life format like Modern, where you're losing life to fetch lands and shock lands and the format's pretty aggressive, giving your opponent a 2/2 is actually a pretty big drawback. And if you look at Swan Song, it never really caught on as a competitive card. The only real place that it saw play was in an old build of Jeskai Ascendancy combo, where you're like, okay, I'm going to use this to protect my combo. It's 1 mana, it's going to counter your counter or whatever you have to disrupt my Jeskai Ascendancy. Sure, you get a bird token, but I'm going to win the game right away, so I don't really care about the bird token. Strix Serenade doesn't really do that, right? The stuff that this hates on, artifact creatures or planeswalkers, is powerful. Think about Modern. It gets Teferi Time Raveler, it stops the One Ring, it stops Ragavan, so it does hit on a lot of things, but these are things that are furthering your opponent's game plan more than like protecting your combo kill like Swan Song does. So all in all, I would be kind of surprised if Strix Serenade really saw play. I think in 60 card formats, the drawback of giving your opponent a 2/2 bird is probably just too much, even though this is efficient and it does hit quite a few things for a single mana. But I think the drawback of giving your opponent a token probably makes it unplayable, or at very best, like a super fringe sideboard card for specific decks. On the other hand, I think this will see Commander play. Like I mentioned before, this isn't going to protect your combo kill like Swan Song, but a 2/2 is just not a big deal in Commander. So if you're playing a casual like 7 power Commander game, I think this is more than good enough. So I would say it ranks a bit behind Swan Song, but a really solid Commander counter, which I kind of doubt it, but could see Super Fringe Modern play. We also got one of the most incredibly busted cards that we've seen from the set so far. This card is absolutely wild in Warren Soultrader. So Warren Soultrader, a 3-mana 3/3 zombie goblin wizard. It's a black card, and its ability is pay 1 life, sack another creature, create a treasure token. So this card is absolutely wild, mostly because there are no restrictions on this. It's not only do it once per turn or like sack a non-token. There's no restrictions. I guess the only restriction is he has to pay a life, but there's so many ways around this. So Warren Soultrader is essentially Phyrexian Altar, except on a creature, with the drawback that you have to pay a life. So if you're going to go infinite with this card, which is going to be its key purpose as just an infinite combo piece, you are going to have to build around that life loss a little bit. Make sure you can kill your opponent before you run out of life. But as we've seen with like Yawgmoth, for example, which also makes you lose a life when you sack something to draw a card, it's pretty easy to build around that. There's a reason that Yawg is maybe the best deck in Modern, one of the best decks in Modern, even though it has that same restriction. So what do you do with this card? Well, first off, it's worth mentioning this card has 2 very relevant creature types. The zombie means it works with grave crawlers, undead augurs, zombies like sacrificing things, and then goblin also has some sack synergies for Shilikmon, Slinging Lieutenant. So those 2 creature types really relevant. Wizard, not as relevant, but still I guess it's a nice little bonus. The main purpose of this card though is just to combo off. So how do you combo with this card? And the list is really long. If you look at Phyrexian Altar, it combos with pretty much anything. I think the most competitive looking combo I've seen for the card so far is Gravecrawler. So think of this curve in Modern. Turn 1 you play Gravecrawler. Pretty decent creature, 1 mana 2/1 that you can cast from your graveyard if you get a zombie. Can't block, but whatever. Turn 2 you play a Blood Artist, so whenever a creature dies, you drain for 1. Your opponent loses life, you gain a life. Turn 3, Warren Soultrader, and then you just win the game. You Warren Soultrader, sack the Gravecrawler to make a treasure token, trigger the Blood Artist to drain for 1, which also will negate the life that you lost or you paid to the Warren Soultrader, and then you can use the treasure that Soultrader make to just recast the Gravecrawler from the graveyards, and Soultrader's a zombie. Do it again, do it again, do it again. Turn 3, your opponent loses all their life. You win the game on the spot. It is 3 cards, but it's 3 pretty good cards that you don't really mind playing. You can also go infinite with like Karmic Guide and Revelark, where you're able to like sack the Revelark, sack the Karmic Guide, the Revelark gets back the Karmic Guide, which can get back the Revelark, and you do it again, so you make a bunch of treasures, use those treasures to win the game. Again, this is the kind of combo that you're going to need a way to negate the life loss if you're going to go fully infinite, because eventually you'll run out of life. But if you make like 15 treasures in this loop, even if you don't have a Blood Artist, you should be able to use them to win the game somehow. The other thing that's exciting about this card, which really puts it over the edge in some decks, is it's a creature. In a lot of ways, being a creature is a downside, right? It dies to a Lightning Bolt or a Fatal Push, but there is a huge upside, which we actually see in the Yawgmoth combo decks, which is being a creature means you can find a card really easily. You can Court of Calling it out, you can Collected Company it out. So I think in the context of these combos, I think Warren Soultrader being a creature is actually an upside, even though it does die to removal, more removal than Phyrexian Altar, because it's just so easy to find. Once you get back to Commander, the combos get even jankier, like Displaced Dinosaur. Displaced Dinosaur says, when a historic permanent enters a battlefield under your control, it becomes a 7/7 dino creature in addition to its other types. So what you can do is sacrifice a random creature to make a treasure, which will be a 7/7 dinosaur, and then hopefully have something like Pandemonium on the battlefield, which deals damage equal to a creature's power when it enters the battlefield, and then you can sacrifice this new 7/7 dinosaur to make another treasure, which will be a 7/7 dinosaur, burn your opponent again. Also absolutely absurd with Chatterfang Squirrel General, because Chatterfang, when you make a token, you get those tokens plus a squirrel, so you sack a random thing, you get a treasure and a squirrel, then you can sack the squirrel to get a treasure and a squirrel, and then you sack the squirrel to get a treasure and a squirrel, so you make infinite mana in the form of treasures. Yeah, you'll run out of life eventually, but throw in a Prosperous Innkeeper or whatever, a Blood Artist or whatever, and you just negate that life loss and win the game. I think this card will see play in so many Commander decks. I'm excited for it in Modern. I think it is a legit Modern combo piece, but if you're playing any sort of sack deck, any sort of Aristocrats deck, most zombie decks, any black-based Goblin deck, this card is just worth playing because it is incredibly strong, even outside of all the combo potential. This is like, you go to Wrath my board, and I sacrifice all my creatures, so I have a bunch of treasures for next turn to rebuild faster than everyone else. So even if you play this fairly quote-unquote, the card is just absolutely busted. So Warren Soultrader, I'm actually legit scared of this card. I think this card is not only good, but out of all the cards we've seen in Modern Horizons 3 so far, this is one of those cards that actually makes me worry it could be too good in Modern and definitely in Commander. Next up, we get a new mono black utility land in Spymaster's Vault. So Spymaster's Vault, it's a land, enters a battlefield tapped unless you control a swamp. So essentially it's formatted like Castle Lockwayne, which has seen quite a bit of play, even back to Modern. It taps to make a black mana, or you can pay a black and tap it, and target creature you control connives X, where X is a number of creatures that died this turn. So Spymaster's Vault, I am very intrigued by this card. So on one hand, the cost of this card is pretty low, especially in a deck with a lot of swamp, some sort of mono black deck. If you're playing fetch lands, it works with dual lands as long as they have the swamp type. So the cost of playing this, like I said, is a lot like Castle Lockwayne, and Castle Lockwayne is a card that I love and I play way too much. It turns out in a mono black deck, it's going to come into play tapped pretty often. I would say overall, I think that Spymaster's Vault is probably slightly worse than Castle Lockwayne. I think I'd rather just draw a card and lose some life than have to connive. The issue I see with this is, for this to do anything, you do need a creature on the battlefield, right? You need a creature to target for it to connive. When Castle Lockwayne works, even when there's no creatures on the battlefield. That said, this can be very explosive. There's a world where a bunch of creatures die in a turn, and this is going to connive a ton, make your creature huge, do a ton of looting, almost like Rafine on a land if enough things die. It's awkward that it doesn't really work with Wrath. That was the first thing I thought is, oh, like Wrath the board and connive a ton. The problem is, if you Wrath the board, you probably don't have a creature, so there's nothing to connive on. I guess you could like Damnation and then play a creature and then activate Spymaster's Vault and connive a bunch, but that's a lot of mana to actually make that happen. I think the best home for this is going to be Sacrifice decks. I think it could see play in Modern, like as a one of in something like Yogg or whatever, a Sacrifice style deck, but I think its primary home is probably going to be in Commander decks. I don't think I would play this in every black deck in Commander. I think there's so many good utility lands now that you can't play all of them. We've reached that point where there's enough powerful lands that you're going to have to leave some powerful lands on the sidelines, but I do think that in sack decks in specific, this card's really going to shine. Like Corvold sacking stuff all the time, and then you just connive and do a ton of filtering. It's really good in Alonda, because Alonda wants stuff to die to put counters on it, and then it cares about its power when it dies, and conniving onto it with Spymaster's Vault is going to make its power really, really big, and then you can sacrifice it and make a ton of tokens and keep comboing off. So I think that's kind of the primary home. I will also say, it might be fine in just mono black in Commander. That's kind of the exception. Once you get to 2, 3, 4 color decks, there's so many utility lands available, and you need so many dual lands to make your mana work, that I don't think this would make the cut for me very often. But in mono black, I think you can get away with playing this card quite a bit, because like I said, the cost is just super, super low, because it's a land that makes black mana and comes into play untapped most of the time in a black heavy deck. So Spymaster's Vault, I don't think it's like busted or anything, but another solid utility land option, especially for mono black decks. We also got a new Rosheen in Rosheen Roaring Prophet. So this is a 4-mana 4/4 legendary giant shaman. It says when it enters a battlefield, you mill 6 cards, and you may put a card with X in its mana cost from among them into your hand, and then you can tap it and reveal any number of cards with X in their mana cost in your hand to add 2 colorless mana for each card revealed that way. Then spend this mana only on costs that contain X. So Rosheen, it's a callback to the original Rosheen, Rosheen Meanderer, which also cared about X spells. It was a 4-mana 4/4 that just tapped to make 4 mana for X spells. I think new Rosheen probably better than Rosheen Meanderer. The bad news is Rosheen Meanderer is nowhere near being modern playable. Like, it is super duper far away. So I think this card is one of those cards that's kind of designed for Commander, even though it's in Modern Horizons 3. It is exciting that it has this Metalworker style ability, but it has a pretty big restriction, right? Like, having a bunch of artifacts in your hand, pretty easy, and then you just make a ton of mana with Metalworker, cast something huge, win the game. Rosheen Meander, not only do you need a bunch of X spells in hand, which is much tougher than artifacts, but then you can only spend the mana on X cost, so you can't even use it to like cast an Eldrazi or something. So I think it's too limited. It is nice that it has an ETB that'll probably draw you a card, but I was looking through Modern and looking at the most played cards, and the cards that have X in their cost are pretty minimal. Like, what could this reasonably hit? Engineered Explosives, Chromatic Ending, Chalice of the Void, Walking Ballista, and that's pretty much it. So I feel like this is a card we could do a cool against the odds with it, try to do like some big X-Spell, Banefire, Torment of Hailfire style deck, which would be pretty funny. But as far as seeing competitive Modern play, there is pretty much no chance here, but it is a cool addition to X-Spell Commander decks. You can play it as your X-Spell Commander, replacing Rosheen Meander, and I think it is just better. If you have a Rosheen Meander deck for some reason, I would just play new Rosheen as my commander and throw Meander into the 99. Also good in other X-Spell decks, which is a pretty niche archetype, but like Magnus Lucia Kane cares about X-Spells, is in the right color, so I think I'd run Rosheen in the 99 of a deck like that as well. So Rosheen, it's a cool design. It's just not really supposed to be a competitive Modern card. It's more of like, you know, one of those niche build around legends, which is perfectly fine. We're getting some cool stuff for Modern in the set. It's nice that Commander players are getting something too. We also got a new reprint for Modern. Speaking of Commander cards, in Cursed Mirror. So if you don't know Cursed Mirror, it's a 3-mana mana rock that taps you at a red mana, but it also can enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield. It gains haste, but you only get it as that creature for 1 turn. So it's a mana rock that also like hastily clones something for a turn. This is a card that the upside's really funny, right? Your opponent plays an Emrakul somehow, or cheats it into play. I guess if they get the extra turn, it's not really going to work. But your opponent like cheats an Emrakul into play, and then you like Curse Mirror, copy Emrakul, it gets haste, attack, annihilate away your Emrakul. Or your opponent plays an Atraxa, and then you copy it and get your own Atraxa. I will say, 3-mana mana rocks are just so far away from being Modern playable. I'd be very surprised if this was actually a competitive card, but it is a really neat mana rock, and I love that Wizards has been focused on these like 3-mana mana rocks with upside. And honestly, I will say, even though this is definitely a Commander card, and we've seen a big focus on Commander cards in Modern Horizons 3, maybe more of a focus on Commander cards than I personally would like, I will say, I do like seeing Commander Precon cards be legal in 60 card formats. Is Curse Mirror gonna be a card that like changes the format or even does anything in Modern? Probably not, but I'm in the camp that I think you just make all the Commander Precon cards legal in Modern and let the Magic gods sort it out. So I am happy that these cards are gonna be legal. They'll be fun for like against the odds decks or whatever, plus it's a fine reprint for Commander players, getting the price down. It's not super expensive, like $4 or $5 or whatever, but still a fine reprint. Pick it up for your Commander decks and who knows, maybe you can do some jank in Modern. Next up, we get a cute little hate card in Disruptor Flute. So Disruptor Flute, 2 mana flash artifact. When it ETBs, you choose a card name, and it says spells with the chosen name cost 3 more to cast, and activated abilities of sources with the chosen name can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. So this card is essentially Curse of Silence, except probably better because it's colorless, mixed with a Pithing Needle. And this is a card that you're probably not ever going to put in your main deck, right? But it serves a very important purpose in sideboards. We see right now in Modern, Pithing Needle is like one of the 15-ish most played non-creature spells in the format because it's a really easy answer to things like the One Ring, Yawgmoth, anything with an activated ability. It's going to be interesting to see how this shakes out. So overall, Disruptor Flute is a more powerful card. It is also 1 more mana, so double the mana, which is a drawback, but it is a more powerful effect. Not only does it shut down a One Ring or a Yawgmoth while they're on the battlefield, but it can also deploy it early and disrupt your opponent from even playing their big payoff. So that is the upside. The downside is part of the reason Pithing Needle sees so much play is you can Urza's Saga into play, which you can't do with Disruptor Flute. So I think Disruptor Flute will serve a purpose. Like, it's nice to have a Pithing Needle that you can just run out on turn 2 and get value out of. When Pithing Needle, if you run out on turn 1, it's not really doing anything because your opponent's not even going to spend the mana to pay the card or whatever, so they're just going to avoid it until they can get rid of the Pithing Needle. But this is better in some ways, right? You can bait your opponent into spending the mana on the One Ring and then flash it in if you want to and shut it down. Or you can just play this early and be like, okay, until this comes off the battlefield, my opponent's going to have to pay 7 mana for One Ring, so they're probably never going to cast it. So I think this card will certainly have uses. It'll see sideboard play. The Urza Saga thing is the one thing that makes me think Pithing Needle oddly might still be better, but this one does have a lot of upsides. Moving into the realm of lower rarity cards, we have a new 10-card cycle of one of my all-time favorite mechanics, which is MDFC lands, and these are even better than a lot of past MDFC lands because they're MDFC dual lands, something we've never seen before. So the front side is a spell, then the back side is a dual land that enters the battlefield tapped and makes either one of the card's colors. So let's run through these cards really quickly because I think pretty much all of these cards are good enough to see play, maybe some of them in Modern, definitely pretty much all of them in Commander. So first off, we have Stump Stomp, which is our Gruul MDFC. So it's 1 and a hybrid red or green. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature planeswalker you don't control. So essentially it's hard-hitting questions plus 1 mana, but the backside is a tap dual land. So if you're looking for a bite effect, this is a pretty good deal. Yes, you're paying like a 1 mana premium over the cheapest version of this effect, although it is intriguing you can cast it for just red mana. I think as a red bite effect, this is the best we've ever seen. So you're paying like 1 more mana than you really want to, but the upside of it being a land more than makes up for that. Then we have Strength of the Harvest. This is one that I think can actually see play back to Modern potentially. So Strength of the Harvest, it's All That Glitters, except it's 1 more mana, but you get a land on the backside, and we've seen All That Glitters be incredibly strong. It's like a Boggle-style staple. It just got banned in Pauper. If you're playing a bunch of enchantments and artifacts, and you're looking to one-shot kill your opponent, this card will get it done. So having an All That Glitters, it's also a land, is ridiculous. This lets you play 8 All That Glitters in your deck without much of a drawback, because it also makes sure that you don't get mana screwed, and you're really incentivized in decks like Boggles that are playing a really efficient curve. Like, you're topping out at 2 mana most of the time. You're really incentivized to play as few lands as possible because you really don't want to flood out. A card like Strength of the Harvest is a way that you can get another land into your deck that also is supporting your game plan. We also got Glasswing Grace, which I think might be the worst of the cycle or among them. So it's 5 mana for an aura that gives enchanted creature +2/+2 flying and lifelink. The best comparison I could find is its Gift of Orzhova +2 mana, but you do get an additional +1/+1. This one I think is just just too expensive to see play in 60 card formats. Maybe in some sort of like Aura's style commander deck, it's fine. I do like the incidental life gain, but a little bit too much mana for Modern. Then we get Rush of Inspiration, and this one's a little tricky to judge because it depends on energy. It's our 3 mana Izzet MDFC. It's instant, draw 2 cards, then discard a card at random unless you pay 2 energy. So if you don't have the energy, it's essentially an expensive Desperate Ravings, which is a card that used to see play, but doesn't really see play anymore because we got a lot better options. If you do have the energy, then it's a Quick Study, which isn't bad, especially attached to a land. So I think this one kind of depends on having energy in your deck. Like, if you can pay the 2 energy, I think the card's pretty solid. Like, Quick Study that's a land and can be cast in mono red is actually really good. But if you are discarding a card at random, probably not good enough. Then we have Revitalizing Repass. 1 mana instant in black or green. It's our Golgari MDFC. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains indestructible until end of turn. Yeah, I mean, this is about as cheap as it gets, right? 1 mana in black or green to put a counter on a creature and make it indestructible. Kind of fine. It's not the best protection. It doesn't give hexproof, so you still get got by like exile-based removal effects, but still, it's just so cheap that I imagine this card in a counter deck or in a deck that needs to protect its creatures could have some uses. Then we have Legion Leadership, and this one is absolutely wild because normally with these cards, you're paying a tax, right? Every single MDFC, almost every single MDFC we looked at, you're paying like 1.5 more mana than you would if it wasn't an MDFC. Legion Leadership, I don't see any tax here. So it's a Boros card, 1 in a hybrid, red or white. It's an instant. It says until end of turn, double target creature's power, and then it gains first strike until end of turn. So this is essentially double cleave. It's worded differently, right? It's actually worded in a positive way, as odd as that sounds. Doubling a creature's power and then giving it first strike is actually just better than double strike because it means it will also work with double strike still. If you double a creature's power and then give it double strike, or it has double strike, you kind of like quadruple up the creature's power essentially. So this card is really wild, and I think this one can definitely see play. Double cleave isn't quite good enough for most decks on its own, but a double cleave that can also be a land and has the upside wording of working with other pump effects and working with double strike, I think gives this card a chance to see play in Voltron decks, anything that's trying to like kill and fiend one-shot kill your opponent. We also got Drowner of Truth, and Drowner of Truth is notable because it's the best MDFC now for the Flicker Wisp plan. If you've never seen this before, we used to do this a long time ago, and it was really janky, but it kind of worked. So Drowner of Truth, it's a 7 mana 7/6. When you cast it, if you spent colorless on it, you get to make a couple Eldrazi spawns, and then it's a Simic dual land. It is devoid. The trick here is casting this for 7 mana, pretty janky. You don't really want to cast this for 7 mana, but a trick you can do with this is play the land side and then use something like Flicker Wisp that can flicker any permanent when it ETBs and then put it back into play on the end step. You can use that to flicker the land Drowner of Truth, and when it comes back into play, it's going to be the front side. So this can be like a turn 3, essentially, 7/6 devoid Eldrazi. So I'm going to be excited to see if we can make that work again. Who knows how good it'll be, but this does immediately become the best MDFC to flicker the land, get the big body out of it. We also got Suppression Rays, which this might actually be the literal worst of these new MDFCs. 5 mana, tap all creatures target opponent controls, you can pay X energy, then choose up to X creatures and put stun counters on them. So if you get a bunch of energy, it's like an expensive sleep. If you don't have a lot of energy, it's kind of just super janky. So I guess if you're an energy deck, this could be fine, but I think this one's mostly for limited. I'd be surprised if this one saw play in constructed pretty much anywhere. Finally, we have what might be the most exciting of the bunch in Waterlogged Teachings. So Waterlogged Teachings, it's mystical teachings. 4 mana, search your library for an instant card or a card with flash, reveal it, put it in your hand, but it's also a Dimir dual land, and what makes this card especially wild is there's really no text on this one. It's 4 mana, Mystical Teachings. Not that Mystical Teachings is busted, but it used to see actually some pretty heavy modern play. Not that it's busted, but it's on rate, right? You're paying 4 mana for either one of those, and in some ways it's even better because you can do this in a mono black deck, so you get that upside compared to Mystical Teachings. So this is a card that I think I will play in probably basically every commander deck that's in its colors. Like, it's really hard for me to imagine not playing this. Remember, I'm the guy that plays all the bad MDFCs. Just because I think MDFCs are such a powerful card type, this is so incredibly above the curve. Getting dual lands and getting a tutor out of it, these cards are just so wild. So I absolutely love this cycle. I would say like 8 out of the 10 I expect I'll play pretty regularly in Commander, and a handful of them I think are actually good enough to potentially see Modern play too. Alright, gonna try to lightning round through the rest of this lower rarity stuff. Essence Reliquary, 3-mana artifact. You can tap it to bounce another permanent you control and all auras you control attached to it back to its owner hand. Activate it only during your turn. So it's just kind of like a crystal shard or a meticulous excavation. Once you get it on the battlefield, just tap to bounce any permanent you control, even with the restriction of only during it your turn. Can offer a lot of value in some sort of Blink style deck, Panharmonicon style deck. Not going to be good at saving your creatures from removal like a crystal shard, but still a lot of value in something that's trying to abuse enter the battlefield triggers. Then we have Amped Raptor, and I cannot shake the feeling that this card is low-key busted. So 2 mana, 2/1. It's a dino with first strike. When it enters a battlefield, you get 2 energy counters, and then if you cast it from your hand, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card. You may cast that card by paying an amount of energy equal to its mana value rather than paying its mana cost. So obviously, if you're an energy deck, this card's kind of wild, right? You put a body on the battlefield, you're gonna have a bunch of energy. No matter what you spin into, you're going to be able to cast it. But I'm thinking of this card not as an energy card, but as an actual competitive non-energy card in Modern. Think, for example, about Burn. If you look at a Burn deck, almost every single card in the deck is going to be 1 or 2 mana. And what that means is your Amped Raptor, no matter what you spin into, you're going to be able to cast just with the 2 energy that it made from its ETB trigger, which kind of makes it like a mini Bloodbraid Elf, sort of, where you get this body and then you're also getting another card to go with it. When you're getting a 2/1 for 2 that is also a Lightning Bolter, a Boros Charmer, Eidolon of the Great Revel, that's kind of ridiculous. But it gets even better if you look at like some of the most recent builds of like Zoomer Jun, the Jun Urza Saga builds. Literally every card in that deck, outside of maybe a couple copies of Fable the Mirror Breaker, is 1 or 2 mana. This is literally Bloodbraid Elf in that deck, except it's 2 mana instead of 4 mana. So you cast this, and then you get a free Bowmasters or Tarmogoyf for Thoughtseize. So I think this card is actually really, really good, and people are kind of sleeping on it. I think it might be one of the strongest uncommons we've seen in the set, and I think this card honestly is good enough to see Modern play. The only thing that gives me a tiny bit of pause is it does die to Orcish Bowmasters, which that is an issue for Modern. Like, things that die to Orcish Bowmasters tend not to be as good as we want them to be. But remember, you are going to get the other thing that you pseudo cascade into, energy cascade into. So even if it does die to Bowmasters, at least you're going to get some value out of it. We also get Victimize coming to Modern for the first time. So 3 mana, choose 2 target creatures in your graveyard, sack a creature, reanimate the chosen creatures tapped. So this, I think, becomes one of the more interesting reanimation spells in the format. Last time we were in Modern Horizons, we got Persist, which immediately became the best reanimation spell in the format. Well, outside of Goryo's Vengeance, they serve different purposes, but one of the best reanimation spells in the format. Victimize, you get some upsides and downsides here, right? Obviously, it's 3 mana, and you need a creature on the battlefield, but being able to reanimate any 2 creatures is incredibly strong for 3 mana. Plus, in a lot of the decks that are reanimating things, you're going to be playing cards like Felicia Archaeologist, Stitcher's Supplier, just to fill your graveyard, to get your reanimation targets in the bin, and they're perfect sack fodder for something like Victimize. So yes, you're going to have the same concerns of any reanimator deck, which is being soft to graveyard hate, but I actually think Victimize is of a power level and works well enough with the support pieces that we could easily see a Victimized reanimation deck in Modern, either joining Persist or Goryo's Vengeance as like a backup, or maybe it's the primary plan if you can build around it. We also got Tune the Narrative, and we've talked a lot about energy and whether energy can actually be good enough to see play because of this set, and if it is, it's probably going to be because of Tune the Narrative. So Tune the Narrative is just 1 mana instant, draw a card, you get 2 energy, and I think this immediately becomes the best way to just add some energy into your energy pool, whatever we want to call that. 1 mana to cantrip and make 2 energy is about as cheap as this effect gets. And remember, last time we had energy in standard, Attune with Ether, which is 1 mana, get 2 energy, search for a basic land, put it in your hand, was so strong that they actually had to ban it out of standard. So I think this is just better Attune with Ether. I think most decks in a format like Modern would rather get 2 energy and draw a random card at instant speed than get a basic land at sorcery speed. So if you're trying to just make a bunch of energy for some reason, I think this card is going to be the card that gets the job done. We also got, this card, Marionette Apprentice, and this is another uncommon that I think low-key is going to be really strong and see a lot of play. So it's a 2 mana 1/2 black human artificer. It's Fabricate 1, so you can either make a 1/1 servo when it ETBs or put a +1/+1 counter on it, which would make it a 2/3. And then it says, whenever another creature or artifact you control is put in a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. So this is essentially in Orcish Bowmasters, in the sense that, and now, just to make this clear, I'm not saying it's as strong as Bowmasters, but it's a 2-drop that makes 2 bodies, right? You get your Marionette Apprentice is a 1/2, which actually survives Bowmasters, which I'm pretty sure Wizards did intentionally because of Bowmasters, but you get a 1/2 and a 1/1. So you're getting the Orcish Bowmasters, 2 bodies on the battlefield for 2 mana plan, and then you're getting essentially Disciple of the Vault. Whenever an artifact goes in the graveyard, have your opponents lose a life, mixed with a pseudo Blood Artist. You don't gain life, but it works with the same combos, right? If you're sacking something infinitely, your stuff's dying, you're going to drain your opponent out of the game. When you add all that together, in any sort of like Aristocrat combo deck, Rally the Ancestor style combo deck, anything like that, I think Marionette Apprentice is really good. Like, maybe as good as Blood Artist, as wild as that sounds. When you add together its better stats and it making a body and working with artifacts. So I would be surprised if there weren't combo decks taking advantage of Marionette Apprentice. We also got a card that gonna get banned in Pauper. I am 99% sure. You might have seen right before Modern Horizons spoilers started, Gavin Verhey from Wizards mentioned there would be a card spoiled that was probably gonna get banned in Pauper, so don't freak out when you see it. Well, this is probably it. So Cranial Ram, a black and a red mana for an equipment. It has living weapon, so it comes along with a 0/0 gerb, and then it says equipped creature has +X+1, where X is the number of artifacts you control. So this is essentially cranial plating, but with living weapon, and it's a common. Cranial plating is a card that was straight up banned out of Pauper and used to see really heavy Modern play. We just saw all the glitters get banned out of Pauper, so we know cards like this are really, really good in Pauper. Whether or not this card can see play in Modern, I feel like cranial plating's day has sort of passed. Like, cranial plating used to be legit one of the best cards in the format back in Affinity's heyday, but Affinity sort of evolved into this simulacrum synthesizer style deck rather than a put a cranial plating on an Inkmoth Nexus style deck. And if you're trying to win that way by like putting a plating on an Inkmoth, you'd rather just have actual plating since you can move it at instant speed, it's less to equip. But the fact that this is a common and you get a germ token along with it makes this card incredibly scary for Pauper, and I would be very, very surprised if this card is still legal in Pauper 6 months from now. I expect this one is almost assuredly getting banned. Speaking of MDFCs, we also got a mono-colored cycle of MDFCs, and the most exciting part about these is they're essentially all mythics. Actually, they're really uncommons, but if you remember in Zendikar Rising, the only MDFCs that had lands that could come into play untapped was the mythic cycle. In Modern Horizons 3, it seems like every single monocolor MDFC, right down to these uncommons, have the option of coming into play untapped with their land side if you pay 3 life, which is exactly how the mythics were in Zendikar Rising. So this is a huge, huge, huge power boost for these cards. Exactly how good these cards are, it really depends on the card. So let's actually count them down. My rankings from least powerful to most powerful. So at the bottom of our list, we got Bridgeworks Battle, which this card, I'm not very hyped for. 3 mana sorcery, target creature you control gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control, and then it can be a land. The problem with this is it's just way too much mana. Like Blizzard Brawl, 1 mana, Bushwhack, 1 mana, and you can get a land. So the cost of fighting something is essentially need less than 1 mana, and this is 3 mana, so there's just a super huge tax here. So this one, I guess you can play it in like a fight deck in Commander, but I don't expect this to see any modern play. Then we have Razor Crash Ambush. So this is 2 mana instant, deals 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature, and this is a fine effect. Like, it kills most cheap creatures when they're attacking and blocking. The thing is, there's just so much good removal in Modern. Prismatic Ending, Path to Exile, Leyline Binding, March of Otherworldly Light. So I don't think this, even with the upside of being a land, is going to beat out most of those options. Then we get to the more exciting ones. These top 3 I think are really good. Sundering Eruption, 3 mana sorcery, destroy target land. Its controller may search their library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle, and then creatures without flying can't block this turn. So a way to sneak in some extra damage. So this is kind of like a cleansing wildfire minus the card draw, but if you blow up your own indestructible land, you can use it like ramp, you can use it to get rid of your opponent's Tron land or Cabal coffers or whatever, and maybe making creatures without flying not be able to block this turn can just close out the game. So I don't think this is a staple or anything, but I could definitely see decks that could use this. Then we have Fel the Profane, and this is just an upgraded version of an MDFC that I've played a lot in Hagra Mauling. So Fel the Profane, 4 mana instant, destroy target creature or planeswalker. Hagra Mauling, essentially the same thing. Sometimes I guess it can be 3 mana if your opponent controls no basic lands, but that's pretty rare. And then it just destroys creatures. So this gets the upgrade of hitting planeswalkers and the even bigger upgrade of being able to come into play untapped if you want to. It's really funny to see the uncommon version just be better than the rare version, but that's where we are. And then number 1, Sink into Stupor, and this card seems really good. So 3 mana instant, return target spell or non-land permanent an opponent controls to its owner's hand, which is basically like a better unsubstantiate. It is 1 more mana, but you get the flexibility of hitting any non-land rather than just creatures, and then you also get the land that can come into play untapped. So I think this one, really easy to slot into some decks and get value out of, especially considering land comes into play untapped. And I gotta say, overall, these MDFCs are just really impressive. I think I will be playing a ton of them in Commander, and I think between the dual lands and this uncommon untap cycle, I think some of them are going to sneak into Modern too. Finally today, a bunch of draft chaff, although I will say, draft chaff from Modern Horizons 3, way better than the draft chaff from most sets. So some kind of cool stuff. If you're going to be doing any limited with this set, any drafts or sealed, definitely head over to MTGPreviews.com and check them out, because these are cards you're going to want to know. And some of them, especially the energy stuff, if an actual energy deck becomes a thing, could actually serve a purpose in Constructed as well. They're just pretty narrow, so unless very specific archetypes need them, they're probably not going to see much play. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Modern Horizons 3 spoilers for today. So let me know what you think in the comments. What card are you most hyped about? What do you think about the new MDFCs? How good are those going to be? How much are you going to play them? Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back tomorrow with even more Modern Horizons 3 spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can check out yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the Against the Odds, where we gained a literally absurd amount of life with Ancient Cornucopias.